Good afternoon and good evening. I'm Howard Gardner, the faculty here at the Graduate School of Education, and I'm very pleased and honored to have the chance to introduce to you David Brooks. But first, a few housekeeping and general details. Some of you read last week about an incident that happened in New York City, and for those of you who do, I want to tell you, this is not Carnegie Hall. It's Askwith Hall. And in fact, you're present here at the Askwith Forum Lecture Series. And in our audience today, we're lucky enough to have Patty Askwith-Kenner, whose family endowed the lecture series. She's sitting right next to our speaker, David Brooks. So we're not in Carnegie Hall, nor are you about to hear Mahler's Ninth. I'll explain all. Rather, you're going to hear Brooks's Third, because David Brooks is going to talk about his third book, The Social Animal. What happened last week was some poor fellow had his cell phone go off in the last movement of Mahler's Ninth Symphony. And to make matters worse, he didn't know it was his cell phone. So Alan Gilbert stopped everybody. And this is a way of saying, please shut off any and all devices. Here's the plan for this evening. David Brooks will talk for about 45 minutes. And then he'll answer questions from the audience. We have microphones on both sides of the room, and David will simply say he's open for questions, and those of you who've been here will know the routine. Just go up to one of the two mics, and he'll take your questions till about 5:30, when I'll call the proceedings to a formal close. Then, after the talk, David Brooks has kindly offered to sign books. He'll be up here on the podium with a little table, and we'll ask people to line up on the flag side of the room so that we just have one queue. So those are, I think, all the preliminaries. Now for the formal introduction. On Friday afternoons, after a busy week, I often drive home and turn on National Public Radio. And I have a rare privilege. I hear a conversation, civilized and respectful, between David Brooks and E.J. Dionne, one considered to be center-right, the other center-left. Not only are these two men civil, sometimes one will agree with the other, and on occasion, you can even hear one say, you know, I think you may be right, on occasion. Now, I'm not a regular viewer of television, but occasionally when I turn it on that evening, on the NewsHour, I see Mark Shield, representing center-left, in respectful conversation with David Brooks. And then, when I return to my computer, if I haven't yet read the paper edition of the New York Times, I go to the blog postings and read columnist Gail Collins, representing center-left, having an animated conversation, often very funny, with David Brooks. The man gets around. Of all the essayists and pundits writing in America today, no one is as continually worthwhile reading as David Brooks. And not only at the 750-word level. His books, ranging from Bobo's in Paradise to On Paradise Drive to The Third, The Social Animal, are widely discussed, often heatedly argued about, and they contribute significantly to our civilized national discourse. Now, I have to admit, living in 02138, I don't always agree with David Brooks, and I suspect that not even David Brooks agrees all the time with David Brooks, but that's just what makes him special. He's prepared not only to change others' minds, but also to change his own mind. You and I, are all in for a rare treat this evening. Please join me in welcoming to Harvard and to the Graduate School of Education the incomparable David Brooks.
Thank you. Thank you, Howard. It's a pleasure to be here, a pleasure to be away from Newt Gingrich for a few days. I wrote in my column the other day that my last trip to South Carolina a couple days ago, I brought my 12-year-old son, and we were at a Gingrich rally, and I I was in the back of the room, and my kid was getting autographs from all the candidates. So he goes up to Gingrich and says, I don't know much about marriage, but what do you have against two men marrying each other? And Gingrich said, it's in the Bible, they shouldn't. And my 12-year-old said, well, slavery's in the Bible. And Gingrich signaled the security guy like this. And so my kid got whisked away. And but that was probably the best moment, even better than a Ron Paul rally, though those have their moments too. It's a pleasure to be here. I'll try to be brief. I've been at Harvard enough to know you didn't come here to hear me speak, you came to hear yourself speak. And so I'll try not to get in the way of that. My day job is writing about politics. And when I got my current, I tell college students, imagine you have a paper due in 3 days, and then imagine that's the rest of your life. That's what I do. And so I was given a good piece of advice by Robert Novak, a late columnist, which was interview 3 politicians every day. Try to just be around them all the time. And I don't always do that, but I do it enough. And I can tell you from that much contact that politicians are all emotional freaks of one sort or another. They have what I call logorrhea dementia, which is they talk so much they drive themselves insane. But what they do have is incredible social skills. Not all of them, but the Bill Clintons of the world, the Barack Obamas of the world, can walk into a room and just sense what's there. And when they stand too close to you, they invade your personal space. I recall years ago I was watching Ted Kennedy and Dan Quayle meet in the well of the Senate, and they were big old friends, and they gave each other a big hug, and their faces were like this far apart, and they were laughing, and their hands were moving up and down each other's backs, and they were sort of grinding away down there, and I was like, get a room, I don't want to see this. But this is the social abilities that the best of them have. The Clinton story I tell is actually here in Boston. I was walking through a hotel lobby. You're going to call this name dropping, but I call it reporting. So I'm walking through a hotel lobby. Clinton comes out, sees me, starts praising me for a column I'd written praising him, which he thought was particularly brilliant. But as people see the Bill Clintons in the lobby of the hotel, they gather around, and within like a minute, there are like 200 people all around. And he wants them all to hear what he's telling me. So he starts backing up, and within a few minutes, he's like 80 feet away, just talking straight at me. He's a natural. Some people are more artificial about it. I've spent a lot of time with Mitt Romney the last few days, another favorite Massachusetts, your neighbor, son of Harvard. And I was up, this was 4 years ago, I was up in New Hampshire before that primary, and he was campaigning with his 5 perfect sons, Bip, Chip, Rip, Sip, Dip, Lip, and Skip. And he goes into a diner, and he introduces himself to each family at each table of the diner, and then he asks them what village in New Hampshire they're from, and then he describes the home he owns in their village, and he's going around the whole thing, and he's met like 30 or 40 people, and on the way out, he first names everybody he's just met. And so that is a skill, and that's sort of what it takes. I was at NIH about 6 months ago, and a neuroscientist showed me she studies people with Williams syndrome, which is sort of like reverse autism. It's people who have not much interest in the physical world, but tremendous social hunger. And she shows me a video of a little girl, 18 months, who's in the room with a 12-year-old boy, and the boy is juggling, trying to get her interested in the physical stuff. She just too close, staring into his eyes, just needs that physical contact. And I looked at this video, and I thought, this is every senator I've ever covered. They all have this. And so, but when you get this social skills, then you ask them to think about policy. Suddenly, all of that human awareness goes away. And so I covered the decline of the Soviet Union, and we sent teams of economists, a lot of them from this neighborhood, into the Soviet Union, and we supplied them with currency plans and things like that. But what the Soviet Union really lacked was social trust, and we were sort of oblivious to that. I remember Gail Sheehy went over to write a book about the Soviet Union, and on the way over, she said she was going to steal the salt and pepper shakers off the tray in the airplane so she could get used to the Soviet lifestyle. And Tatiana Tolstoya reviewed the book for the New Republic and said if she wanted to feel get used to the lifestyle, she wouldn't have stolen the salt and pepper. She would have stolen the tray. She would have stolen the car it came on. She would have stolen the airplane and the airport. And because the lack of social trust meant corruption was rife, but we were blind to that in the beginning. I covered the Iraq War, obviously, and I once asked a member of the Bush administration, it was off the record, so I can't tell you who she was. I asked, didn't you guys kind of get the culture of Iraq wrong? And she said, well, I don't really believe in culture. I think if you change institutions, you change a society. And that may be the right political science answer, but it's not the right answer. And so that was a mistake. We had a financial regulatory regime based on the supposition that bankers are rational, self-interested creatures who would never do anything stupid en masse. That turns out not to be true. This week in The Atlantic, there's a very good story about a young woman named Mattie Parley. And Mattie Parley is the product of a home her father left and abandoned her when she was very young. She was a pretty good student. She got through high school, but she got pregnant her senior year. And so her dreams of going to college were vanished because the guy left. And so she was a single parent. And she couldn't afford daycare. And so she had no chance of going to college because she couldn't take care of the kid and she couldn't afford to do it. So she got a job temping. And she works at a factory, and she was lucky she got a job in a manufacturing plant. And she makes $13 an hour. And she'd like to move up and become one of the skilled workers where you're making much, much more. And the writer in The Atlantic describes the skills she would need to move up to that level. And she'd have to know trigonometry, calculus. She'd have to know the properties of cutting tools because they make metal there. And she'd have to know how to have the language, that the computer language that the machines rely upon, and how to adjust the tolerance of the machinery to a 0.25 micron level. And she doesn't know any of that. It would take her 2 years. And the good thing about that story is it illustrates the interplay between the social factor, the breakdown of the family, and the impingements it puts on lives, and also the global economic factor and technology. And it's the interplay between the soft and the hard that makes so many of our social problems, like wage stagnation and inequality, hard to fix. But if you've just come off the Republican trail, as I have, they don't talk about that social factor. They just think more capitalism is the answer. And if you go to President Obama, as I have recently too, he sort of knows the family is a problem and those social things are a problem, but it's more politically convenient for him to talk the language of populism, that we're just going to raise taxes on the rich. And so both parties have trouble talking about the social side. And that, again, they've become dehumanized. And then finally, I got into this whole subject because I've been covering school reform since The Nation at Risk in '83 or '84. And since then, we've spent so many years, and I've covered so many reforms that have produced disappointing results because we've spent so much time rearranging the bureaucratic boxes, big schools, small schools, charters, vouchers. And when the elemental fact of education is people learn from people they love, it's the individual relationship between a teacher and a student. But if you mention love at a congressional hearing, they look at you like you're Oprah. They just do not want to speak that language. And so what we have is these most socially adept people on earth becoming socially inarticulate and ignorant when actually conducting policy. And I think this is not only a problem of policy, but a wider cultural problem, that we've got a view of human nature that we're rational individuals, and we progress to the extent that reason can suppress the passions. And this has led to what Alistair McIntyre called a great amputation. We're good at talking about money and material things. We're bad at talking about character and emotions. Economics has become the gateway between all of the social sciences and policy making, because the language of economics is the language we can understand. And so it means we ignore all the soft stuff. Karl Popper had a great formulation, some of you probably know, between clocks and clouds. A clock problem is the kind you can take apart and analyze piece by piece. A cloud is a dynamic system, and you have to understand it as a unified whole. We're very uncomfortable with cloud problems, and we try to turn them into clock problems. And I think this is all part of this sort of the mechanistic style. And it leads to a style of child rearing which emphasizes the things we can count and measure, and the things that show up in Harvard applications. And so, you go to a school in an upper middle class Brookline type neighborhood, You watch the kids come out, they've got these 80-pound backpacks on their backs. So if the wind tips them over, they're like little beetles sort of stuck there on the ground. Then the cars come up to pick up the kids, and they're usually Audis or Saabs or Volvos, because in neighborhoods like Brookline, it's socially acceptable to have a luxury car so long as it comes from a country hostile to U.S. foreign policy. That's fine. And in one of my books, I wrote about the creatures who picked them up, who I called Uber moms, who are highly successful career women who've taken time off to make sure their kids can get into Harvard. And you can tell the Uber moms because they actually weigh less than their own children. So at the moment of conception, they're doing little butt exercises to stay fit and trim. And then during pregnancy, they're taking so many soy-based nutritional formulas, the babies come out like these gigantic 13-pound toothless defensive linemen sort of plopping out there. The Uber mom is cutting the umbilical cord herself and flashing little Mandarin flashcards at the thing so he can get into Harvard. They take him to home and they stop at Ben & Jerry's, so he'll be sort of socially enlightened, have a enlightened ice cream. I joked in my first book, I think that Ben & Jerry's should make a pacifist toothpaste. Doesn't kill germs, just ask them to leave. It'd be a big seller. And they get baby formula from Whole Foods, where all the cashiers look like they're on loan from Amnesty International. And I have a joke in another book about the snack food section at Whole Foods, because they couldn't have pretzels and potato chips, that would be vulgar. So they have the seaweed-based snacks. In my household, we get this thing called veggie booty with kale, which is for kids who say, Mom, I want a snack that'll help prevent colon rectal cancer. And so they turn into, they've raised these wholesome kids, and they've turned them into the junior workaholics of America, and sort of the tiger momization of child rearing. And if you remember the tiger mom, what she did was she forced her kids studying and doing the piano and the violin, but she didn't let her daughters go on sleepovers. And I wrote a column saying, Tiger Mom is a wimp, because doing homework is cognitively demanding, but if you want to know what's really cognitively demanding, send a girl to a sleepover with 8 other 14-year-old girls. I don't know that from personal experience, but that is the richness and the thing the brain is actually designed for. And again, it's a style of child rearing which emphasizes the hard stuff and amputates the relationships and the things that actually matter. And so I'm stuck in this policy world, and I think in a broader culture, and at the same time there's a breeze blowing the other way, a breeze that actually illuminates all the things the official culture can't illuminate. And the odd thing is it wasn't theologians, it's not philosophers who are looking deepest into what we really are. It was neuroscientists I found doing it, and cognitive scientists. It was Steven Pinker and people like that. And the fields that they were looking into were supplying a lot of the things that I, as scientific illiterate, was really curious about. And so the book is really my attempt at a popularization of what a lot of people are finding about what's happening and how it illuminates what's going on deep inside. And I think if you take the research done over the past 30 years into the neuroscientists and the cognitive sciences, you come with 3 foundational principles. The first one is that most of our thinking is unconscious. Timothy Wilson at UVA says the human mind can take in 12 million pieces of information a minute, of which it can be conscious of 40. So most thinking is below awareness. And from Danny Kahneman's book, which I highly recommend, Thinking Fast and Slow, there are a million examples of this, but there are 3 that amused me from his book, and there are a bunch more in mine, but he's Danny Kahneman. And one is, if you eat alone, you eat this much on average. If you eat with one other person, you eat on average 35% more. And if you eat with 3 or more other people, you eat on average 78% more. Sociability just has this effect on how we eat. Another thing he mentioned, a study of pro golfers. Somebody studied 2.5 million golf putts on the PGA Tour. And people from all distances and all conditions putt more accurately when putting for par than when putting for birdie. And that's because they fear the bogey more than they desire the birdie. We fear failure more than we desire success. That's called loss aversion. And then he mentioned a study of Israeli parole boards, which give prisoners 6 minutes to present their case, and they grant parole on average 35% of the time, except in the hour after breakfast and lunch, when they grant parole 65% of the time. And so if you're applying to medical school, you want the admissions committee to read your application on a sunny day rather than a rainy day because the admit rates are higher. And so these just are some examples of the unconscious things that are going on through us all the time, and there are a zillion different examples, influences of this. And so one of the scientists told me, if you have trouble making up your mind, tell yourself you'll settle it by a coin flip, but don't go by how the coin flips. Go by your emotional reaction to, does it comes up heads or tails? Are you happy or sad? And that's what you really want, that you just didn't know. So that's the first principle. The second principle is that emotions are not separate from reason. Emotions are the foundation of reason. We have this model in our head that it's on a seesaw. If we're emotional, then we're not being rational. But that's confusing emotion and arousal. Emily Dickinson was very emotional. We wouldn't say she was screaming all the time. And that's because what emotions do is they assign value to things. Emotion is the valuation system in the brain. And if you don't have that system, you can't make what we call rational decisions. One of the great pioneers in this field is at USC, Antonio Damasio, who studies patients with lesions in their brain that can't process emotion. His patients are not super smart Mr. Spocks, they're super dumb. They ruin their lives because they just make terrible decisions. Or they can't make a decision. In one of his famous cases, he had a guy come in every week, and 1 week after an appointment, he said, do you want to come in next Tuesday or Wednesday? And the guy literally spent 30 minutes debating with himself the relative merits of Tuesday or Wednesday. He couldn't assign value to either day, so he couldn't reach a conclusion. And so that's what emotions do. And now I'm a middle-aged American guy. I'm not comfortable talking about emotions. My wife's joke is that me writing a book about emotion is like Gandhi writing a book about gluttony. It's not my natural milieu. And I cherish, though I think it's apocryphal, a brain scan study where they took a bunch of middle-aged guys, put them in an fMRI machine, had them watch a horror movie, and then had them describe their feelings to their wives. And the brain activity was the same in both activities. So it was just sheer terror in both cases. And so I sort of get that, but nonetheless, emotion is central to how we reason. It's central to determining what we remember. It's central to a million other processes, and there's even some evidence it literally is part of wiring the brain together. And in orphanages 50 or 60 years ago, there were some orphanages where they took kids and they decided they wouldn't handle them because they didn't want to give them germs. So they gave them medical care and food, but without the fondling. And the mortality rates at some of these orphanages were 38%. They stopped naming the kids because they were dying at such high rates. And it's that physical affection that actually seems to have some effect of wiring the brain together. So that's the second foundational principle. And the third is we're not as autonomous as we think we are, that we're deeply interpenetrated one with another. There's a controversial concept called mirror neurons, which is one of the more problematic concepts in the field. But the general idea is that we don't only observe each other, we mimic what we see other people doing. So when you see me shoot a free throw, you in your brain are actually shooting a free throw. And the general point is that we have what they call para-conversations going through our minds all the time. And some of it involving things we don't even think about much. So one of the most powerful ways we communicate is by smell, even though we're mostly not aware of that. And so one of the books I read suggested that people who lose the sense of smell suffer a greater emotional deterioration than people who lose any other sense. And the study from Germany sort of backed this up. They took gauze pads, taped it under people's arms, had some of them watch a horror movie and some watch a comedy. And then they took other research subjects who were presumably well paid and asked them to sniff the gauze pads and say, which movie did this person watch? And people could tell it way above average chance, and women are better at this than men. And so it's a mode of communication. And so that if you take these principles and this research and you apply it to my world or to the world we all live in outside the field, I think it gives you a different sense of how life works. And in short sports terms, the French Enlightenment loses and the Scottish Enlightenment wins. And so the idea that reason is the supreme virtue and should crush the passions, probably not true. But if you're David Hume or Adam Smith or others who had great sense of the power of our sentiments and the weaknesses of reason, then you get an appreciation. And so the idea is we have these two systems, and you need both systems to do any process. the rational, logical, and linear system, which is the voice in our head and which is good in math, and then the automatic, unconscious associative system, which is really bad at math, but pretty good at making associations. And it's about the volley between these two systems is what really determines how we do. And this highlights different skills that are actually go into determining what human capital is. And the one we're familiar with, which is important, is IQ and how you do on SAT scores. And that certainly is important. It's probably the single most important. But it's still, the research is incredibly varied, and I really couldn't make sense of it. But it seems to be accurate, or at least not totally awful, to say that IQ explains like 25 or 30% of the variance in job performance. But that means the vast majority is still other stuff. And what is that other stuff? And so I think if you take a look at the research, you can find some talents which are not measured by IQ and SAT scores, but which actually are tremendously valuable. And I'm just going to list a couple of them. The first is what you might call mind sight, the ability to meet with people and download all the information they have. And so babies come equipped with this. Alan Meltzoff at the University of Washington famously in, I think, 1979, leaned over a baby who was 43 minutes old, leaned over the baby, wagged his tongue at her, and she wagged her tongue back at 43 minutes. Because babies are wired to mimic. That's how they learn. And so we have these mimicry skills. And the most germane one to education is the ability to model relationships. And so some kids at 18 months, because they have a secure attachment to mom, not only have a model in their head of how to attach to mom, they have a model in their heads of how to attach to teachers when they get to school and how they attach to peers. So they know how to build relationships. And Alan Sroufe at the University of Minnesota said by looking at his attachment patterns at 18 months, he felt, and I'm not sure everyone agrees with this, but he felt he could predict with 77% accuracy who was going to graduate from high school by looking at attachment at 18 months. And then that's about 55% of the kids in this country have what they call secure attachment. Another 20 have what they call avoidant attachments. I read a good description a teacher gave of a kid with an avoidant attachment coming into the classroom, describing the kid like a sailboat tacking into the wind, wanting to get close to teacher, but not knowing how to do it, and ending up with his back to teacher, hoping somehow the teacher would establish something with him. But he didn't know how to do that. He didn't have the models in his head. And avoidantly attached kids, even at age 70, have far fewer friends on average than those who have secure attachments. So this is an ability to really enter into the mind of others and build those relationships, and that's a very important talent. The second one is what you might call equipoise, which the scientists use the word metacognition. For example, we're overconfidence machines. It won't surprise any students at Harvard to know that 95% of college professors believe they have above average teaching skills. Time magazine asked Americans, are you in the top 1% of earners? And 19% of Americans are in the top 1% of earners. And 35% expect to be next year. So we tend to be overconfident. Two researchers, Paul Schumacher and Edward Russo, gave tests to business executives about their own industries and then asked them how confident were they got the answers correct to those tests. And people in the advertising industry gave answers they thought were 90% correct. In fact, they were 60% wrong. The most overconfident industry in America is the computer industry. The executives there were confident they got 95% of the answers correct. In fact, they got 80% of them wrong. And this, by the way, is a strongly gender-linked trait. Men drown at twice the rate as women because men have tremendous confidence in their ability to swim after they've been drinking. And so that's a flaw in the way we are. But yet some people have the ability to step back and be aware of that, to be open-minded in the face of ambiguity, to adjust the strength of their conclusions to the strength of the evidence, to be modest in the face of partial knowledge. And these skills, according to a guy at the University of Toronto, are only partially related to IQ, the ability to judge your own thinking processes. And then some people have the ability to self-awareness to build modesty bootstraps for themselves. And so one of them is to write a pre-mortem. When you're going to make a decision, write out a short story based on the supposition that your decision went disastrously wrong. because we tend not to think of those negative scenarios. Another one, I think this is a Peter Drucker one, which was when you make a decision, write out your reasoning, seal it in an envelope for 9 months, and then open it up. When you open it up, you'll find a third of your decisions were right, a third were wrong, a third were in the middle, but your reasoning is almost always irrelevant to how it turned out. And so that's sort of a modesty reminder. The third trait, I use a Greek word here, which I'm going to mispronounce, called metis, which is pattern recognition. The ability to look across a landscape and detect the essential patterns. This is largely an unconscious trait. And so my newspaper had a story about soldiers in Iraq, and the soldiers could look down a street in Baghdad and tell whether there was an IED, a landmine on the street. And if you asked them, how do you know? They said, I don't know, I just feel a coldness inside, because they knew when something was vaguely wrong. There are chicken sexers in the world who work in chicken farms, pick up the chicks when they're minutes old and tell whether it's male or female. And they're phenomenally good at it. But when you ask them, how do you know, they can't tell you. I read a book recently called The Wayfinders about the South Pacific Islanders who could sail across thousands of miles of open ocean, even though they didn't know how to navigate by the stars and they didn't have compasses. And the way they could do it, they had a guy in the back of the boat who no one talked to, who just observed. He observed the shape of the waves, the nature of the clouds, the vegetation, the water. And by this sheer close observation, they could navigate across thousands of miles in open water. And so this is not something that comes natural. Blink is not quite right. It's not just something, a natural thing. It comes from hours and years of close observation. And the famous experiment that describes this phenomenon is they took a bunch of chess grandmasters and chess novices and gave them 4 seconds to memorize a chessboard. And the novices could memorize like 4 or 5 pieces on the board. The grandmasters could easily memorize the board. But then they took the pieces and arranged them such that they could never actually occur in a chess match. And in those cases, the grandmasters were no better than anybody else. And that's because the grandmasters didn't see individual pieces when it was in that original formation. They saw formations. The difference between memorizing a story and memorizing the individual letters in a story. And that just comes from years of close observation and the way models and maps of reality get instilled in the mind. And some people are just much better at that than others. The fourth trait is sympathy, the ability to be sensitive to surroundings and to your social surroundings. This comes in handy because most of us work in groups, because groups are generally smarter than individuals. Somebody did a good study that I couldn't put in the book, it came out after, of the Olympics, the swim times in the Olympics. And they compared the swimmers when they swam in individual events to swimmers when they swam as part of a relay team. And swimmers swim much faster when they're part of a team than they do as individuals. And they're much, much faster when they're the third and fourth leg of the relay team because they feel essential to the team. And so that's group motivation. And they now have this thing called group IQ. And how do they tell? Certain groups have consistent IQs over time, and their effectiveness at completing tasks. And that effectiveness is not determined by how smart the people are in the group, the average IQ or the median or even the top IQ or the top member. It's determined by how well they talk to one another and read each other's signals, how often they take turns in conversation. And for that reason, by the way, face-to-face groups are just much more effective than groups that meet electronically. At the University of Michigan, they did a study where they combined, gave groups math tests. Some groups had 10 minutes to solve a problem, and they met face-to-face, and they could do it easily. Some groups had 30 minutes, they had to communicate by email, and they failed. And so, because so much of our conversation is subliminal, being face-to-face just much more effective. And so these are some of the traits that we could, that really are highlighted by this research that supplement, though don't replace, the traits we're used to talking about, the hard skills that we're used to talking about. And the final trait I'll call limerence, which is not so much a trait but a motivation. And my conclusion was that what the conscious mind is the things the magazines write about. And that's the ability to be rich and famous and have high status and all that. But what the unconscious mind hungers for is this trait I call limerence, which is when self-consciousness fades away. And when you're lost in a task, when an artist is lost in the art, when a believer is lost in love of God, and when a naturalist is lost in transcendence with nature, and the unconscious hungers for those moments. And it emphasizes the power of relationships. And so, for example, we know a fair bit of this stuff called happiness research. And I entered as a skeptic, but the results are reasonably robust. And so we know money correlates a bit with happiness. The richer you get, the happier you are, though there's a tail-off effect at the top. We know age correlates with happiness. People are quite happy in their 20s, and then they're sort of a shallow U, and they hit the nadir of their happiness at age 47, which is called having teenage children. And then they hit the peak of their happiness in the first 10 years of retirement. And it's not a strong relationship, but there's a relationship. But the essence, the most important thing to happiness by far is relationships. A guy who did the famous Grant study here at Harvard said happiness equals love, full stop. Having a marriage, I tell college students, every class you take should be about your marriage partner, how to pick a marriage partner, because that's the most important decision you're going to make. If you have a great career and a crappy marriage, you will be unhappy. If you have a great marriage and a crappy career, you'll be happy. And so colleges should offer marriage courses, how to choose, they should have Anna Karenina, psychology of marriage, neuroscience of marriage, they should all do it in there. Nobody does that, but that's part of the great amputation I talked about. And so the research emphasizes this ability to lose yourself one with another. And in the course of the research, I came across a passage which captures a lot of the themes I've described here, and it's from an Indiana University, I think it's a mathematician. His name is Douglas Hofstadter. He wrote several great books, but the one this comes from is called I Am a Strange Loop. And Hofstadter describes going on sabbatical in Italy with his wife, Carol, and their kids, who at that point were 5 and 2. And I think while they were over there, Carol suffered, I think, an aneurysm and died very suddenly. And Hofstadter had a photograph of Carol on the bureau in his bedroom, which he probably looked at every day. But in a couple months after she died, he looked at it with special attention. And here's the passage that he wrote about that experience. I looked at her face, and I looked so deeply that I felt I was behind her eyes. And all at once, I found myself saying, as tears flowed, "That's me, that's me." And those simple words brought back many thoughts that I had had before, about the fusion of our souls into one higher level entity, about the fact that the core of both our souls lay our identical hopes and dreams for, about the notion that those hopes were not separate or distinct hopes, but were just one hope, one clear thing that defined us both, that welded us into a unit, the kind of unit I had but dimly imagined before being married and having children. I realized that though Carol had died, that core piece of her had not died at all, but that it had lived on very determinedly in my brain. And so the Greeks used to say we suffer our way to wisdom, and the wisdom Hofstadter suffered his way to is what he called the idea that we have these loops going through us all the time, and some of them we're aware of. They come out of our mouths, and we're consciously aware of them. But many of them we're not aware of. And that the loops connecting us, that nurture us, that build us, that grow us, are loops that are unconscious. And it seems to me if you take that knowledge, the first thing you do is you have to have a broader conception of human capital and a different set of human capital policies. When you look at a school, you have to know that what goes on in the classroom is important. But what's cognitively really demanding is what goes on in the cafeteria. And then if you're going to attach kids to a school, as one school superintendent told me, what keeps my kids attached to the school is the ABCs, the athletics, band, and cheerleading. And somehow we have to have a balance, which we do not have, between the things that are measured in NCLB tests and the things that are this soft and squishy stuff. Because one of the themes of the research is the things that seem soft and squishy are actually hard and practical. That when you read the humanities are in crisis, but when you read Anna Karenina or you listen to a symphony, you are broadening your emotional repertoire. And you use that broader emotional repertoire in making decisions. And then I think you see as you go into the classroom, you're not only looking at the facts that are being transmitted, but what teachers are doing is A, they're modeling a way of being in the world, since we forget 90% of what we actually learn in a classroom. but we remember our teachers. And second, what they're doing is they're showing the interplay between these two mental systems, the conscious and the unconscious. And in the book, I tried to describe this process by which education happens, a more complex process than just downloading information, which is a process first of just downloading facts, second, reweaving facts by going over and over. So the unconscious, which is constantly trying to create ordered maps, is reweaving the information into different pieces of paper. Third, sort of a phase of frolicking, when you do play acting and other activity to gin up the creative juices and re-see the facts. And then finally, the bringing the facts to a point by writing a paper or whatever it takes to organize them coherently. And that's a quick summary of a much more complicated dance between the two different systems in the brain, which is what education really is. And so I think we've had a really decent set of human capital policies that give people access to institutions of education. We have a terrible job of getting them to complete. And I think that's partly academic preparedness, partly finance, but mostly emotion and relationship. The people who complete college have close relationships with the college, close relationships with the people at the college, and feel emotionally engaged at the college. The people who don't have those relationships are much more likely to get out. And so one of the conclusions of the research is to give us this broader access of human capital and to suggest a second generation of human capital policies. And then the second idea, and this I'll close on, which is sort of ancillary, though of tremendous interest to me right now, is it makes you suspicious of those cultural forces that impinge relationships and that get in the way of the building of the deep and rich relationships that make us flourish. Now, my reading of the research, and I guess Howard is going to write about this, my reading of the research is that online social media is not a problem in this way. That my reading of the research, and maybe others know more than I, that what you bring to social media is more important than the social media itself. That if you have healthy relationships, real friendships, then you use Facebook just to augment those healthy friendships. If you bring to Facebook a sense of loneliness, then you can mask your loneliness by having fake social media friendships. But social media doesn't strike me as a social disaster. What does strike me as a very social disaster is the sense of self that young people are now raised with. And I'm a big fan of the younger generation. I think if you look at social indicators, they're all moving in the right direction because of people under 30. So teenage pregnancy is down a third, teenage violence is down, crime is down 70%, domestic violence is down 50%. I think people under 30, divorce rates are down a third. People under 30 are an incredibly hardworking and responsible generation. I think the people under 30 are going to have the biggest midlife crisis in human history in about 10 years. But right now, very hardworking and responsible. But the one part of youth culture which I do have concerns about, and it goes certainly back to boomer culture, is the sense of self. And I'll just conclude with a few statistics on this. In 1950, Gallup asked high school seniors, "Are you a very important person?" And in 1950, 12% of high school seniors said, "Yes, I'm a very important person." They asked the same question in 2005, and it wasn't 12% this time, it was 80%. And so that's sort of a change in attitudes. If you look at American math scores, you'll know, you're familiar with the data, I'm sure, that we're like 36 in the world in a proficiency in math. If you ask, are you really good in math? We are #1 in the world in thinking we're really good at math. And so the traits, the psychologists have this thing called the narcissism test they give people, and they ask you, do you agree with these statements? And the statements are things like, I like to be the center of attention. I'm a special person. I usually show off if I get the chance because I'm extraordinary. I find it easy to manipulate people. And the median score on these tests has risen by 30% since 1980. And so the median has shifted far over. So 93% of the teenagers now score higher than the 1980 median. Going along with this is a tremendous interest in fame. Fame barely registered as a life goal 20 or 30 years ago. Now it is one of the highest life goals to become a celebrity. Some middle school girls were recently asked, would you rather be Justin Bieber's personal assistant or president of Harvard? And it will surprise no one that the vast majority would rather be Justin Bieber's personal assistant, though I think that may apply to the president of Harvard. That may. The other thing that struck me was that they did a study with college students. Would you rather receive praise and be slightly famous, or would you rather have sex? And the vast majority of college students would rather receive the praise than have sex. And as someone, I'm 50, I remember sex, and I'm on TV, I'm slightly famous, I can tell you sex is a lot better. And so I do think we've spent a generation describing, telling people, maybe 2 generations, how special they are, and they believed us. And this has created a rise of narcissism. And it's not the same as the Christopher Lasch narcissism, but I do think it has an effect on the broader public. So for example, if you have a sense of your own modesty of how little you know, then you realize you need people who disagree with you to correct for your own errors. If you think you basically have the truth by the balls, then people who disagree with you are just in the way. And it's no accident that Rush Limbaugh's 2 shticks are tremendous grandiosity and also tremendous partisanship. If you see yourself as just part of a chain of generations, I think you're going to be very hesitant to impose debts on future generations. You're going to have a moral horror of that. But if you see yourself separated from other generations, you will have less of a moral horror than that. If you think of yourself as a pretty special person, you're going to want to spend on yourself as befits your station. And so one of the interesting things that's happened about consumption is through the 20th century, consumption levels were astonishingly flat until about 1980 or 1975. And then personal debt as a percent of GDP is no longer 43%, which it had been for generations. It shoots up to 133%. And so that's, I think, a real life change based on a cultural shift. And so that's my concern with some of the trends which eat away, I think, at the ability to form the sort of relationships and put yourself in a subservient role that is what this research so much emphasizes. Nonetheless, I do think we're at the beginning of something tremendous in understanding how we are. When Freud has his conception of the unconscious 100 years ago almost, it really had a tremendous effect on culture and how we saw ourselves. And the New Republic even had a Freudian columnist where they would say, he would analyze current events from a Freudian perspective. So he'd say the Soviet Union was at a very anal phase this week, something like that. And now we, I think, have a much more accurate view of the unconscious and what's going on inside ourselves. And I think it's going to have a tremendous effect on our culture. And I have to say, the world of education has been way in advance of every other world in incorporating these into actual policy. But other worlds, economics, finance, politics, consumerism, they're catching up. And I think it can only have good effects to understand ourselves better and maybe be less stupid in the future. So thank you very much. Now, if there are questions about Ron Paul or Sarah Palin, I'm happy to do those, or Barack Obama even. Sir.
Hi, thank you very much. A quick question was, how do you see all the trends that you just described playing out in the pursuit of a common good, whether it's in politics or in schools or in smaller communities?
Yeah. Well, in my world, the common good in politics is not a highly valued thing. And so I often leave conversations with individual members of Congress thinking reasonable in private. It's only when they get out in public that they begin to act like as partisan and as short-term as they seem. Walter Lippmann had a great line, they hide their virtues and display their vices. And so I do these Sunday shows, and one of the virtues of doing a Meet the Press type show is that you have an hour or so before the show in the green room with the politicians, and you're sitting around chatting. But that's somewhat been defeated recently because they have begun insisting on separate green rooms, Republicans from Democrats. And so that is a lack of the common good. And so in my world, it's diminished. And I'll say it's different actually among, say, the two candidates. There's just tremendous rewards for having a Manichaean view, for assigning the view that Obama's a European socialist. And you sort of can get away with that. In fact, it's hard to succeed in a Republican primary unless you say that. And similarly, Obama says Republicans believe in trickle-down economics. Well, no Republican believes in that, but that's the way you mobilize your people. And the hardest thing in any life is to be unpopular in your own workplace. And so one of the things you see is that every Tuesday the senators and the House members get together for what they call policy lunches, where the leaders hand out the message of the week. And you have to recite that message, and if you don't recite that message, and if you sometimes agree with the other side or work with the other side, you're a betrayer to your team. And so that really has begun to eat away at this notion of the common good, which they all sympathize with, and by the way, they all individually hate it. They all did not want to serve in this kind of Congress or in this setting. And it's been most interesting to see Obama, who's a natural, if there's a conflict, he loves to transcend it. And I think he came to Washington sort of believing he was going to transcend it. And as time has gone by, and you have these off-the-record conversations with him, you've seen his frustration level rise, but you've also seen the political calculations impinge on his policy views more and more. And even if you go in to talk to the wonky staffers, the economists, they have their views, but there are strict barriers to their fences that sort of impinge their thinking because the political considerations are so great. And I think that's why we're due for a fiscal crisis. We're just not going to, whoever wins the next election, we're not going to deal with the onrushing debt, and eventually we'll have a crisis, and then we'll get serious and deal with it. But so I am a great optimist about the culture of America, the innovative power of America, but as far as the political system orienting around a public good, I remain a serious pessimist, which is not to say the country wouldn't like it. Just one final point, the reason the center, the reason why you don't even need a center, you just need people who can take from category A and category B and put them together. And the reason that hasn't happened is partly fundraising, partly gerrymandering, partly intellectual deficit in the center. If you go to a liberal think tank, there's a bunch of academics. If you go to a conservative think tank, there are a bunch of academics. If you go to a moderate think tank, it's just a bunch of lobbyists. There's no ideas in the middle. And so that's another gap, I think. So I'm really, it's decline in Rome. No, it's not that bad, but there's a lack of common good.
As a researcher and practitioner interested in helping teenagers do exactly what you were saying, which is love well and find a marriage partner, based on all those different things you were talking about, limerence and all those other things, can you be any more specific about how we might be able to approach that? What would that course in a college look like based on all this research you've done? Especially at a time when I think, from what we can see, college kids are really, both females and males, are really hesitant to go in that emotional direction. And it's much more about, even people in their 20s, what's the balance sheet on this person, rather than their emotional response to that person.
Yeah.
So,
well, first, I mentioned it at colleges and high schools even, and people look at me like they're from Mars, because the odds are great that they're not going to be married before they're 28 or 30. And so I guess my advice, first to college, what the course, I haven't really thought about my fantasy course, but there are, I could off the top of my head think of some novels about good marriages and bad marriages, and some biographies of good marriages and bad marriages. Obviously they're more bad, but there are some pretty good marriages you look at Harry Truman or Dwight Eisenhower. There's some people that, or even Ronald Reagan, pretty good marriages. Some bad marriages. Yeah, I would read Anna Karenina, things like that. And then there's some research into what's likely to increase your chances. And basically, similarity works. The idea that opposite attracts, not so much. And so one of the things is people naturally do this. They marry people with eyes similarly far apart, nose widths of similar distance. So you really want to measure the noses. No, I'm just kidding. People marry people with similar immune systems. Women, unfortunately, tend to like to marry guys with high status, which in our society means a lot of height. Though I mentioned in a book, a Dan Ariely study, that he found on a guy who's 5'6" can get as many online date offers as a guy who's 6 foot, so long as he makes $172,000 a year more. I don't know why that study's germane to me. Happily married. But I do think that those 20s, it's that there is this new phase of life. You graduate 21, 22. In 1964, if you graduated from Harvard at age 22, it was tremendously likely by 25 you would have bought a house, you would have gotten a full-time serious job, and you would be married by 25. Now the odds that will happen by age 30 are much smaller. So there's this phase of life from 22 to 30, which is a new phase of life, vastly under-institutionalized. And so I just think that's the phase in which to experiment and take your time. Your parents will go insane while you do it. But it's still nonetheless worth taking the time to just experiment with the different things and just appreciate how important the life is. I just did this thing in my column where I asked people over 70 to send me what I call life reports, where they looked back on their lives. And easily the most important thing was some people had marriages that had lasted 50 years, and the whole essays about themselves glowed with a sort of happiness. There was a lot of people who married young, and those people said, I wasted 12 years of my life, I remarried later, and then I was smart enough to work it out. And so that just being aware of that, the importance of that decision, and not doing it because you feel horny, is like half the battle.
Thank you again for your lecture. I'm wondering, as we get to know much more about how the human mind works, you mentioned so many of the potentials for education and for institutions. But I wonder, what is your take on the dangers as well? Specifically, I think you talked about the rise of consumerism. But could that also be in part driven by your increasing knowledge of how our mind works and your ability to play with people's emotions, to get them to buy and consume and make decisions that are against their self-interest in the long term?
Right. I think that's possible. And well, one of the things the research shows you is how little those things make you happy. That if you win the lottery, you will be happier for a few weeks or a few months, but you'll go back to your normal happiness level. And so if you bother to read the research, you don't get too hyped up about the idea that physical things are going to make you happy. Nonetheless, the ability to manipulate based on knowing how to frame subjects, how to prime. So for example, if there's one study where they took people through pool table stores, and if you take people to the cheapest pool table and then to the most expensive one day, and then the next day they took different customers from the most expensive pool table to the least expensive. And the people who went to the most expensive first on those days spent, I think, 35% more. And that's just the numbers they were primed with. But this is not exactly new. We didn't need this research. If you go to the grocery store, they walk you through the fruit section first, because you'll feel so virtuous buying fruit, you'll buy more Cheerio or Fruit Loops later on. And so since there's been consumerism, they have certain knowledge. And so I think some of it, they'll have more refined knowledge on how to manipulate people. And I think that's somewhat true. The only thing that I think is saving is that we are so complicated, that there's so many different factors, that it's, I think it's hard to have really powerful manipulative effects, just because it's just so complicated. Nonetheless, you can think of many examples. There's another study I saw, if they played French music in a wine store, people bought more French wine. German music, I think they bought more German wine, which must be really good music, because the wine is not so good. But so the capacity to manipulate is there. But I I think we're just too damn complicated to really control.
Thank you for your talk. I hope that people in the room will take it as a challenge over the next 10 or 20 years to figure out some of the implications for education. I guess the short question, which I want to embroider a little bit, is, how do you think some of this knowledge can get into elementary and secondary schools, which is the interest of a lot of people in the room. And I would give a couple of examples. There's a well-known mathematics educator named Debbie Ball. She's a professor, but she wanted to teach 5th grade as part of being a professor. And if you look at the videos of her classrooms, the kids have fantastic communication skills. They actually can dialogue and say these sophisticated things even when they're 4th graders. You have the National Center for Education Statistics makes it really easy to find out how many kids took algebra, let's say, every year. Very difficult to find out how many people took psychology or sociology. Buried way deep. So anyway, the short question is, how can we get more of this into elementary and secondary schools?
Yeah, well, as I say, I think a lot of it is happening. And I think there are many schools now based around some of the research. I mean, the most famous are the KIPP schools, which are very explicitly, I didn't tell the story of Walter Mischel's marshmallow experiment. I assume everybody in this room knows the marshmallow experiment, but they have explicitly based their curriculum around those self-control things. And the interesting thing about the KIPP schools is that they're both very data-driven, but they also, in the mornings, they have chants where they chant, what is earned, everything is earned. They do all the priming things, so that if you go into a classroom, the classrooms are named after the college the teacher went to get people used to thinking about going to college. Your graduation year is not the year you're going to graduate from high school. It's the year 4 years hence when you're expected to graduate from college. They teach people to look at each other in the eye. So they embroider not only the education, which is accountability and tests, but with an entire social subculture. And there's a guy, I'm not forgetting his name, at the University of Virginia, Turkheimer, I think Eric Turkheimer, who has this thing called the gloomy prospect. And what he measures is IQ and poverty. And people who grew up in poor homes, unless they get enrichment, have less IQ because they're in less enriched environments. And so he was asked by an experimenter, well, what factor explains the poverty and explains the lack of enrichment? And he tried to isolate a series of factors, and he couldn't find any factor that explained it. And he said it exists in the gloomy prospect. It's a whole series of factors that we'll never understand, the interplay of which somehow leads to this effect. And so the lesson is, don't try to pick out one factor, create a whole subculture, a whole counterculture. And that's what KIPP does, that's what the Harlem Children's Zone does. I understand Roland Fryer is trying to do research on the qualities that separate the rare, really good charter schools from all the others. I'm afraid those qualities will all have proper pronouns. They'll all be people, not factors. But if there are factors that are communicable, that would be the sort of thing that the KIPP does. But there are a million different examples. Bill Gates talks about having the lectures be at home and the social interaction with the teacher be at school, which is sort of the reverse of what happens now. And so I just think a lot is going on. The final thing I'll say is the research disproves a lot of myths, which is useful in itself. I came into this research project thinking there was such thing as learning styles. It seemed logical to me, but I gather from the researchers there are no consistent learning styles. And so that's useful to know in itself.
Hi, your insight on this is really fascinating to me, but I have a question. So one of your concerns about young people is their inflated sense of self-worth. So my question is, what about young people that come from communities or groups that are systematically devalued, right. Especially it could be what leads them to success or resiliency. So I'm just kind of curious at what you have to say about that.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And I'm writing my next book about this, so I have all sorts of theories. But basically, we had an ethos of I don't know if you put it modesty, but self-effacement, where nobody was better than anybody else, but you were better than nobody. And there was a code that went with that, I think, through most of human history. And one of the stories I tell is about George Marshall, the great military leader. He was chief of the army in World War II. He desperately wanted to lead the D-Day invasion. And Roosevelt knew he had to give it to him because he deserved it. He was such a great general. Churchill told him he was going to get this job. Stalin told him. So Roosevelt calls him in the office, and he knew if Marshall asked for the job, I'm going to give him the job. And Roosevelt asks, do you want to lead the D-Day invasion? And Marshall said, my feelings should have no bearing on your decision. His entire code was based on the idea, it's not about me, I'm never going to talk about me. And as a result, he didn't get the job and he was crushed. And that's sort of an ethos and a code. The problem is it's a really good code for people who are born to privilege. And that code eroded for a very good reason. Because in the 60s and 70s, when you had especially minorities and women who as they gained more access to opportunity, their problem wasn't arrogance, their problem was they didn't think they were capable of doing it. They needed the boost. And so the boost, that old code had to die to get a fairer society. Nonetheless, I think and it accompanied a series of people like Carl Rogers and other psychologists who said, our problem with our patients is not that they're too happy with themselves, they don't have enough self-love. And so we got to give them a lot more self-love. And that was somewhat legitimate too. But my point would be that we've sort of gone a little overboard. Not in all cases, again, depending on where you come from. But I think we've gone a little overboard, at least in middle-class American society.
In my reading of the recent social sciences literature, it seems to me one of the recurrent themes is this problem of cognitive dissonance and the recurrent pattern of studies where people have a certain we have a conception of how the world works. And we are resistant to either ideas or, more importantly, facts, which are inconsistent with that preconceived notion. And I guess the problem I struggle with is, what does that say about the basic idea of a deliberative kind of government?
Yeah, that's a good question, because we all have, confirmation bias and things like that. And I would say, well, this is something that's made me more hopeful. When I got into this research, I went to conferences here at Stanford, and I met a lot of neuroscientists and cognitive scientists. And I was really struck. They all think they're petty and they have fights with each other. But I was so struck by how I saw people again and again have their minds changed by evidence. And in my world of politics, that never happens. Never.
But that's my point.
Right.
Academics, you can do this, but what happens in politics?
Well, I guess the thing I would say is, Santayana had a phrase, we never solve debates, we just leave them behind. And so what happens is we don't admit error, but we move on and embrace and then say, well, we always saw that coming. And so I do think the deliberative process, this goes into the whole argument in this field, which I found sort of interesting, is whether we have free will or not. And I ran into so many researchers who think it's absurd. Of course we don't. I happen to think we have at least what they call free won't, the ability to say no to things. And I certainly came away thinking our free will is bounded. But I do think we have this ability to step outside ourselves and evaluate. And I think most of us in our private lives have the ability to learn. The problem comes when that ability to learn is cross-pressured by the ability to be loyal to, the desire to be loyal to a team, desire for popularity. And in those cases, the evidence is the rational ability to learn is crushed by the other things.
Thank you. Could you comment on two issues? One, the current initiatives to measure, sometimes even quantify the effectiveness of teachers in the context of hard versus soft, and a related issue, your feelings on whether teaching is fundamentally an art or is it a science?
Well, as someone who thinks both systems are important, I guess I'd say it's both. But I would have to lean on the art side. I think the social science model of human nature, and I think this is not controversial anymore, is a completely bogus model. The idea that we're rational, utility maximizing individuals, I think that's a bogus model. I'm very suspicious of efforts to use the methodologies of physics to try to predict human behavior. And so I'm quite skeptical of the whole concept of social science. And so I do think it's more of an art, and I think great teachers probably don't understand why they're great teachers. You just have to look at the results. And so I've forgotten what the first question was. What?
The effort to measure
Yeah.
effectiveness in teachers.
You know, I've, as I say, doing all this research, I'm suspicious of this, of relying overly on what can be quantified. But I would say two things. First, the schools like the KIPP schools, just to beat on that example, they do the measuring more than the other schools, and they do the squishy stuff more than the other schools. It's not either or. And second, I think the reformers who I'm a fan of, including our Secretary of Education and others, they really value those measurements because it's the only form of accountability we have. And so I think they see it as a leverage tool to improve the schools. And so I think those measuring abilities, and from what I understand of the research, good teachers are consistently good teachers across years. And you saw the research done recently. I've forgotten who did it or what university, but it came about 2 or 3 weeks ago. Oh, jeez. I should have guessed. Okay. Well, in that case, I don't trust it. Forget it. But just the long-term quantifiable impact. So, you know, I would say just following the intellectual trends. You guys are experts, not me. It's rare that you see a field with a bunch of different interests, from my perception, cohere into the importance of teachers as the key interest. Maybe I'm wrong about that's where the field is, but from the outside, just reading the journalistic reports, that seems to be where the field is going. And those of us who are not experts just follow along where we think the field is going.
You talked a lot about the importance of relationships within education. I would love your thoughts about how do you embed that in federal policy? Because it would seem that the policy is based on distrust, and we have to have legislation because if we don't, teachers or educators won't do it. So,
yeah. Well, I'm a big believer, and this is also Timothy Wilson at UVA, is that you can't change your mind and then change your behavior. If you could do that, then New Year's resolutions would work. So what you have to do is change your behavior and then change your mind. As the folks at Alcoholics Anonymous put it, fake it till you make it. And so if you want to get people from different parties or different factions to get together, you actually have to force them to get together. And somebody tried that at the Annenberg Foundation. They took all the members of Congress, took them to the Greenbrier Hotel in West Virginia with their family on the supposition they'd actually get to know each other. And I was invited to one of these sessions, and I liked seeing 170 drunk members of Congress at karaoke night. That was interesting. But the symptomatic moment was walking down the hallway of the Greenbrier Hotel, and there's a woman in the hallway weeping because she'd been one of the breakout discussion sessions, and she'd been so viciously attacked, she'd left the room in tears. And this was called the Civility Summit. And so it takes some time. But nonetheless, I do think that effect of actually getting people, forcing them together, is the only way you break down these factional barriers. Evan Bayh is a senator from Indiana who just retired after 12 years in the Senate. In those 12 years, he said the members met as a body twice in 12 years. I have a dumb quota system when I conduct interviews. I interview one Republican and one Democrat. I just want to keep it balanced. So I go from one office to the other. And I can tell you, whenever I hear a member of a party start to tell me what members of the other party are thinking, I know everything I'm about to hear is false, because they just don't know. I actually go back and forth. I always want to be an ambassador, tell them, no, they're actually thinking this. They've become very much strangers to themselves, to each other. And so I think the way you change behavior is just force them together somehow. And if I had, I have some ideas on how, one of the things I would change the voting schedule. The voting schedules are all Monday through Thursday or Monday through Wednesday, so they all fly home Thursday over the weekend. They're never there. I would have 3 weeks of voting and 1 full week off. So they'd actually be around on the weekends together. I would force them to drink. Lyndon Johnson, in those days, they had bourbon. There was a tradition of having bourbon after votes. And they got drunk with each other, and now that doesn't happen. I have a bunch of other ideas. The only institution in Congress I hadn't thought about sex. The only institution in Congress where they actually meet each other across party lines are what they call codels, when the members of Congress go abroad on a trip. That's the only time. And so I do a lot more of that maybe. But anyway, the research, the emphasis is on changing your behavior to change your mind.
Hi, Mr. Brooks. I wanted to circle back to a point you made earlier about, the Mitt Romneys and all the politicians with the exceptional social capacities. My question is, in your experience, have you ever interviewed somebody successful where you felt that this skill was absent? And if so, was there another quality, another characteristic about him that somehow made them compelling enough to, appeal to an electorate?
Yeah, there are people who succeed despite not being particularly great at social interaction. One of them used to be president here. But Richard Nixon was not great at it. They can fake it, but they tend to have some. It's rare that you get people who read people completely wrong. Obama is an interesting case because my pop psychology of him is, first, he's a very writerly personality. He's stepping back and observing. Second, this is really pop psychology, but we all have multiple personalities, multiple selves. I think he has more multiple selves than most of us. And so he's always self-observing at all times, which makes him pretty good at self-criticism, pretty bad at being all in. But nonetheless, he has the ability to be pretty observant about others. I recall this, and again, a name-dropping story. When he was in the Senate, I wrote these columns attacking the Republican Congress for spending too much money, and then I throw in a few sentences attacking the Democrats just to make myself feel good. And one morning I get an email from Obama and said, "David, if you want to attack us, fine, but you're only throwing in those sentences to make yourself feel good." I thought that was pretty good. It's pretty astute. And in general, I would say even he who's less Clinton-esque than Clinton has that ability at above average. Bush, by the way, he had some intellectual weak spots. Though I always say his IQ in private was about 60 points higher than in public. I've never interviewed a politician where there's as big a disparity between public and private. And so people at Harvard say, okay, 60 points, that brings him up to 80. But he was very well read. He read way more books than Obama, by the way. And when you talk to him about Russian history, he would talk about Peter the Great and stuff. He would never allow him to say in public. But he had a phenomenal, he was actually quite good at judging people, where you were coming from. And he was too dismissive. You'd interview him and he would say, "I'll tell you what the problem with French policy is. That guy Chirac, he's a fucking asshole. That's the problem." And so he would sometimes simplify a little, but he was quite good, I would say. And so in general, they have those abilities in politics. What goes with that ability, and this is my final point, is the hunger to be around other people. Most of us need time alone. Most of them don't. We need sleep, food, they need people. And so, for example, I used to follow John McCain around on the campaign trail, and he was never alone at any point in a 24-hour day, except for in the bathroom. And so you'd go to an event with him, he'd be surrounded by hundreds, then you get back on the bus and there'd be teams of journalists surrounding him, event, bus, no moment when he was alone. And this would go on for years. And so a lot of them are actually a little afraid of being alone. And so they'll always have people with them, aides, because they just don't want to be alone. And so that is a pluses and minuses. Obama, who does like to be alone, it's a bit of a minus because he doesn't have as good relationships with members of his own party, because he doesn't need to be around them all the time. And if he goes to a Super Bowl party, he actually watches the game. Which, believe me, most politicians, they wouldn't see the game, they'd be schmoozing. But I would say it's a rare trait in politics, which is why us academics or writers or journalists are not politicians.
Two very quick questions. A colleague of yours at the Times, Tierney, informed or reported that about 95% of social scientists identify themselves as liberal Democrats or liberals. How do you think this affects the research? That's the first question. The second question is, you mentioned bourbon. I think Arnold Schwarzenegger found that cigars helped. What's your opinion on that?
I think cigars are very polarizing. So I'd stick with the bourbon. I think they bring people together. Vodka, Russian example, is a bad one. Stick with bourbon. For the social science, I do think it's true in my experience. And what are the effects? Well, one of the effects is that there's a lot of incredibly stupid research looking at the brain scans of Republicans versus Democrats and think you can find some solution. You can look at their brain scan and tell whether they're conservative or liberal. I think there's also, here, I'm going to say this as nicely as I possibly can, as someone who spends a lot of time with conservatives. Sometimes I'll read people from, let me phrase it this way. Let's say you're a Harvard freshman and you come from Idaho and you listen to your professors talk, and I've observed this phenomenon many times, about the politics of the right. And what your natural reaction is, these people are idiots, they don't know anything. You should not extrapolate that to the field they do know about. And so the nice way to put it is, or the less, maybe that wasn't the nice way to put it, but there's a lack, I think often, not all the time, and often a lack of awareness of what makes conservatives tick and what the world is like. The world of evangelicals, the world of in the gun rallies, the world of the Tea Party. I often read these things and think, these people have just never been out there, they just don't know. And so that's one thing. And second thing, and I'll recommend a book that's coming out in the fall by a guy named Jonathan Haidt at the University of Virginia. And he did this test, which I initially was skeptical of, but have become more impressed by as the years have gone on the different moral sentiments surrounding the two belief systems. And his view, to summarize very simply, but the book is going to be worth reading, is that liberals tend, and again, there's a generalization, to have an idea of moral systems built around autonomous individuals, that what's just, what's fair, what causes pain, what doesn't cause pain to individuals. Conservatives, he said, have another vocabulary which concerns the sacredness and the security of the social order. And conservatives are more in tune to insults to the invisible order. And I'm probably not doing justice to those ideas, but I do think there's some merit to those different categories. And so I do think it's a huge problem for the academy, that there are different vocabularies that are not represented. And then, frankly, in my life, I went to the University of Chicago, and my parents were academics. I was going to go into academia. And I thought, it'd be really fun. I still would love, at some level, to be an academic. But I didn't want to be the only conservative on campus. I taught at Yale during the run-up to the Iraq War, and they would have panels with 8 professors and a guy named Don Kagan. And then the next night, another panel, 9 other professors, Don Kagan. So here it's 9 professors, Harvey Mansfield, 9 professors, Harvey Mansfield, 9 professors, Harvey Mansfield. I didn't want to be that guy. And so I went into something else. So I do think it's a genuine problem with the academy. So there you have it.
Hi, so I'm asking this question because you're a man who just talked about the importance of soft skills to a world that prizes hard skills, but I also have a brother who's telling me, why can't you speak more rationally? Well, I don't understand why you're crying. And so I was wondering if you could just comment on what you think are the different issues involving gender, if there are issues that you think of, just in this whole sort of reintroduction maybe of the importance of soft in a world that prizes hard skills.
Well, there is a research, it may be done at Harvard, that suggests that men are from Mars and women are from Venus. I will say a lot of what I've described to you, I'll have feminist scholars come up to me and say, duh. And I do think, I'm rarely accused of being ultra-feminist, but I do think a lot of what goes on is a certain male-dominated worldview which is crumbling and being crumbled by the research. And one of the things, by the way, that's been frustrating to me is, and this is a slight dodge of your question, is I've spoken to the thing I care most about is early childhood education. And so I've spoken to probably every single U.S. senator about early childhood education. And especially with the male senators, but also the women, they nod, they pat you on the head patronizingly, and then they want to go off and talk about the defense budget. They just don't take it seriously. And so there's like a social status hierarchy of issues. And issues having to do with early children is just not as real an issue as guns and banks. And I do think that is just how our cultures have been, and I think there's some genetic reasons and some cultural reasons for that. And I will say the one culture which has completely reversed this, maybe to it overly much, is the evangelical culture, where being a sensitive guy has now become the cool thing. And you just want to slap them sometimes. Okay, shut up already, stop crying. But I do think it's a historical legacy, but which is crumbling on the male side because it's dumb. Maybe we should take one more, I'll answer quickly.
Okay. I'd love to hear a little more about something you brought up in your most recent column in the Times about the Republican Party being sort of a place of a dying male white culture. You brought this up, and I'd love to hear a little bit more about as we become more multicultural and more global, and how the white privilege in white society is adjusting and coping with the changes that are underway.
Yeah, well, this was a stray thought. I wouldn't put it in a theory, just something I threw out there to see if anybody noticed. And I'm in Iowa, New Hampshire, and South Carolina. I'm going at least dozens of rallies, and it's all whites. It's all middle-aged. But what struck me this year was how backward-looking it is, and the sense of restoration that we used to have something, we've lost it. And it's a vague sense that we've lost our mojo. We've lost something valuable, our values, our responsibility, our work ethic. We've got to go back and get it back. And that's somewhat a natural conservative attitude. You can tell what kind of conservative a person is by what year they want to go back to, by whether it's the 1960s or 1900 or 13th century. And I share that. I do think we've lost some things, and that culture of self-effacement would be part of it. Nonetheless, when you combine that with the ethnic changes you weren't seeing at the rallies, partly it's the 3 states I happen to be in, and with the demographic changes, the thought does occur. I will say the counter evidence is, 40% of Americans call themselves conservative and 20% call themselves liberal, so who's fading away? And so I don't think, if you ask people, who do you fear, big government or big business, 65% fear big business, or big government, and only 20% fear big government. So there's still a rightward shift to the electorate. Nonetheless, there was that tone of backward feelingness to those rallies that elicited that thought. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate it. Thank you.